I did a segment over the weekend regarding Fidel Castro, the fact that he wasn't an angel, but he wasn't the devil either. And I was really happy to see this particular segment on the Roland Martin show where I believe the consensus is in agreement with basically what I said. Now, if you are a white Cuban and you got your stuff taken away from you, obviously you have one point of view. You believe that Fidel Castro was the devil incarnate. But for the most part, if you were a black Cuban, you were happy to see Fidel Castro come in because all of a sudden there was a much greater or much more level playing field. Fidel Castro came in and he wanted and tried to eliminate 100% of discrimination. Now, that was a pie in the sky goal, but for the most part, he got rid of an awful lot of it, He did that via having national health care for everyone, okay, which led to infant mortality rates being some of the best in the world. People in Cuba living longer because of the superior health care, and their health care system is superior to ours, okay? And number two, their educational system. Education in Cuba is free for everyone. All you have to do is have the smarts. You don't have to worry about having the money, okay, which is vastly superior to ours at the present time. Now, did Castro do a lot of stuff that we really don't like and wouldn't want to put up with? Absolutely, okay? Did he restrict certain rights of the citizens? Yeah, he did, okay? Did he restrict the right of the press? Yeah, he did. Did he do, did he kill a whole bunch of people? Yeah, he did. But I don't know this for a fact, but I think most of the people that he turned around and killed, the aspiring squad, were part of the corrupt Bautista regime. The people that were killed were people that were torturers and murderers, etc., etc. He killed a bunch of mafiosa guys that they caught in Cuba. So yeah, he did kill a bunch of guys, all right? But the same can be said about the United States. And as a matter of fact, with all the drone strikes, etc., there are a whole lot of innocent people, men, women, and children, that have been killed in these strikes. So the United States does not have the higher moral ground here. The United States also supported the president of Turkey, which not too long ago suffered an attempted coup by the military, okay? We supported the president, and when he got back into power, and he was never out of power, but when he got back into country, within 24 hours, he was rounding up all of the people who attempted to revolt against him, and he executed them. But you don't hear any moral outrage about that. So anyway, here's the story with commentary from various panelists. Now, one thing, Jesse Jackson, who met Fidel Castro, issued a tweet over the weekend, and that tweet brought about a firestorm of people condemning Jesse Jackson. So, and I'm on Jesse Jackson's side, to be honest with you, because nobody is perfect. Nobody's either an angel or a devil. Yeah, Castro did do a bunch of stuff that a lot of people didn't like, but he damn sure did a bunch of stuff that most black people liked. He supported black people during our time of trials and troubles in the 60s and 70s. He gave at least one Black Panther sanctuary in Cuba because the American government was attempting to railroad them, okay? There were a lot of good things that Castro did. He fought against apartheid, okay? Nelson Mandela and he appeared together, and Mandela thanked him for his support. Here's the clip. Decide for yourself, and if it's not enough information, do your own research.
Folks, for a half century, Fidel Castro held a tight grip on Cuba, defying a CIA-backed invasion, numerous assassination attempts, a U.S. trade embargo, and economic collapse. As his health failed, Castro ceded power to his younger brother Raul in 2008. But for most Cubans around the world, until his death on Friday, Fidel Castro was the only leader the country ever knew in the past half-decade. He came to power in 1959 after overthrowing the American-backed presidency of Fulgencio Batista, who ran an authoritarian government and was viewed by many as corrupt.
Yeah, okay. So he overthrew a corrupt government backed by the United States. Oh, but supposedly the United States is always on the right side of everything. Yeah, that's bullshit.
Castro aligned his country with the Soviet Union in 1961.
Why did Castro align with the Soviet Union? Because the United States attempted to assassinate him multiple times. How the fuck would you feel if a government or a country was trying to kill you? Yeah, hell yeah, if you wouldn't run to their adversary looking for support, because I damn sure would.
President Kennedy ordered an ill-fated CIA-backed invasion of Cuba. The mission was called the Bay of Pigs, and Castro served up a humiliating defeat for the U.S. A year later, the U.S. and the Soviet Union played a game of nuclear brinkmanship in Cuba. The so-called Cuban Missile Crisis ended when the Soviets agreed to dismantle their nuclear weapons and remove them from Cuba.
Yeah, and at the same time, the United States agreed to dismantle and remove their nuclear missiles out of Turkey. But that piece was never publicly advertised.
And President Barack Obama traveled to Cuba this March, the first sitting president to do so in 88 years. In late 2014, he issued an executive order that normalized diplomatic relations with Cuba and eased travel and trade restrictions between the two countries. The president released this statement upon Castro's death. At this time of Fidel Castro's passing, we extend a hand of friendship to the Cuban people. History will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure on the people and world around him. During my presidency, we have worked hard to put the past behind us. We offer condolences to Fidel Castro's family, and our thoughts and prayers are with the Cuban people. Now, President-elect Donald Trump released a harsh statement calling Castro a brutal dictator and said his legacy will be one of firing squads, theft, and unimaginable suffering. In Little Havana, in Miami, Cuban Americans celebrated Fidel Castro's death. Many saw their families torn apart after Castro took power and seized property and jailed dissidents.
Now, notice one thing. You don't see a whole lot of black Cubans out there. The majority of the Cubans that you see out there celebrating are the white Cubans, okay? And I want to say something further, but I'm going to leave it right there.
Millions also fled the country. It was an interesting reaction when you look at African Americans. Fidel Castro was seen by many as a leader who was unafraid to stand up against racism in the U.S. and abroad. He fought against racial segregation in Cuba when he came to power. At the height of the civil rights movement in America, Castro met publicly with Malcolm X. He sent Cuban troops to Angola to fight against the apartheid government of South Africa at a time when the U.S. still supported it. And the list goes on.
Again, he was on the right side of history, and the Americans, the United States, was on the wrong side of history because we supported South Africa in apartheid, okay? Just like we supported racism, or the American government supported racism in this country, and they still do.
And he also fought against apartheid in South Africa. So what do we make of these different complex views of Fidel Castro? We've got three guests who can break it down. Joining us via FaceTime from New York City, Soledad O'Brien, the CEO of Starfish Media Group. By telephone from Chicago, Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., founding president, Rainbow Push Coalition, and here in studio, Bill Fletcher Jr., writer and activist, also former leader of Trans-Africa. I want to go to Reverend Jackson, start with you first. Reverend, your statement you released ticked off a lot of people. They said it was tone deaf. And how could you make those kind of comments about Fidel Castro? What was your relationship with Castro? How many times did you meet him? And how should we view his legacy?
There were competing legacies about Fidel Castro. One is that His overthrow of Batista, a corrupt dictator, which reduced black Cubans to commodities in that situation, facing racial and class segregation. You don't see as many black Cubans in the streets as you see white Cubans in the streets, which was a part of the internal contradiction within that society. On the other hand, his thing against racial defiance in Harlem in 1959, that's 6 years before blacks had the right to vote. That's after 5,000 blacks in this country have been lynched without a single indictment. His staying in the Theresa Hotel in New York when we could not stay in the Holiday Inn or the Marriott or the Hilton in this hotel. Latin American people on the occupation rejoiced. South Africans rejoiced. In the end, was his military participation in Angola and Namibia to stop South African expansion. And that's why Mandela rejoiced and thanked him. So you have people who were displaced understandably upset and angry. We must fight diligently for family reunification, but there are competing legacies, and there's a reason why people who were oppressed identify with this revolution.
Soledad O'Brien, your mother, Afro-Cuban. Your perspective as someone whose mother had to contend with Cuba and Castro as a leader.
All right, so that you just got the quote-unquote black point of view. Now you're going to get the white point of view. Soledad O'Brien's mama was Cuban. Her dad was white, and she's married to a white guy. So it'd be fair for me to state that she's going to take a different perspective.
Yeah, and I think Reverend Jackson is right in a lot of ways. I think when Donald Trump describes Castro's only legacy as firing squads and suffering, that is very true, but it's not the full story. And so I think what Jesse Jackson describes is also part of a complete story. Listen, my mother hated Batista, who she grew up under, and hated Castro, and left Cuba just before Castro came into power to go off to college. And I think she thought both of them really destroyed the country. But I think those who don't really fully study what Fidel Castro brought to Cuba, both the horrible things, he was a brutal dictator, and also some of the big things that he brought in terms of healthcare and literacy, those things are often talked about. And even trying to stamp out racial discrimination officially. I don't think he ever was able to do it. And I think if you look at Cuba today, discrimination still exists. But I think that those are conversations that make the understanding of Fidel Castro much more than a binary. He was evil, he was great. I think he was evil, and there are all these other things that he accomplished that are part of his legacy. Now, there are plenty of people who don't want to talk about legacy. They just want to say, here's what he did to my family. And those people I understand. I mean, you know, he killed a lot of people. He led firing squads. And Raul Castro, in many ways, was even more, I think, dangerous and killed a lot more people than Fidel Castro. So I understand those who are not interested in the nuance of legacy, but I think politicians need to try to really understand, because otherwise you don't understand the different perspectives of the Cuban people. Afro-Cubans look at the death of Fidel Castro differently than white Cubans who are in Miami, than Cubans who are in New Jersey, than Cubans who are in New York City. So I think it's important to understand that part of his legacy.
Bill Fletcher, it is interesting when you look at the coverage over the last couple of days, how so much of it is driven by, as Soledad said, the Cubans in Little Havana. Protesting in the streets, and when I tweeted over the weekend, because I was retweeting Soledad, I was retweeting Reverend Jackson, and I made this comment about Fidel Castro being a complex figure. Other folks just lost their mind, but the reality is, it is a complex situation when you say here he provided refuge for a Black Panther who escaped prison, Shaba Shakur. Right. When you also talk about the issue of apartheid, when you talk about offering assistance to the United States after a hurricane, then you talk about people bring up drugs, they bring up, you can go down the line. This is a complex world figure. Your perspective, your thoughts, had you met him, and if so, your impressions?
I met him in January '99. as part of a delegation to Trans-Africa Forum, participated in, and this was prior to my becoming president of Trans-Africa. And it was absolutely an amazing experience because of the brilliance of this person. Someone who was incredibly knowledgeable. I saw someone write about how much he knew about the U.S. political system, more than probably most people in the United States. But you know, Roland, the thing I would say is this: there's an immense amount of hypocrisy in the United States when it comes to looking at the rest of the world, and certainly when it comes to Cuba. So they talk about Castro allegedly killing all these people. How many people are executed on a regular basis in the United States? I mean, we talk about dissidents. After the American Revolution, thousands of people fled the United States to get away from this great country. Thousands. Yet when we look at history, there's no nuance. There's no analysis. It's either one way or the other. And I think that the discussions about Fidel Castro in the media have been incredibly biased and lack that analysis that would help people understand the types of things that both Reverend Jackson and Soledad are raising.
Reverend Jackson, you negotiated the return of Americans who are being held captive in Cuba. Again, for our audience, just an assessment of what it was like sitting across the table negotiating with Castro. Listening to him talk to him, I was when I interviewed Harry Belafonte, he talked about how a visit with Fidel Castro could last anywhere from 6 to 8 hours because he would hold court that long.
Well, when we last met, or really first met, should I say, in 1984, I was told if I don't raise 3 critical issues, that this would not be credible. The issue of prisoners. I discussed political prisoners with him. He granted release of 48 Cuban and Cuban American prisoners. Some have been in jail 25 years. We were able to bring them from Havana to Dulles Airport and release them, deposit them, should I say. Secondly, the issue about free press, which I challenged, but I also realized that before in 1959 there was no black journalist, column of American newspaper across the South except me, Ralph McGill, who was white, who was credible in that anti-Southern racism at the time. This issue about his going to church. He asked me to speak at the university with him. I asked him to go to church with me. He went to me to church for the first time in 27 years. Asked him what happened. He said the kid he grew up in the church to be a priest. And he came back, they got back into the city. He thought the church would be a sanctuary, but the ministers were standing in the courtyard with guns to protect the graveyards of the rich. So he became anti-church for down enough to bomb it. So I said, but Dr. King and theologian like Bonhoeffer would be on your side of history. He revisited that question and began to open up. And open the Pope found reconciliation with Castro. That's why I say it's a complex situation. And I understand those who were left there under either Batista or Castro, but as a fight against occupation and racism, colonialism, he became and remains, frankly, a global believer. And also, I might say that while we were sending guns to Latin America, he was sending doctors. All this country produced the most doctors with a 99% literacy rate. That is a mile around the world. And right now, many of our doctors are doing research to find that. Research from cancer research in Cuba even today.
So that to pick up on Bill's point.
Those things are all true, and then I'll do a big but, right? So my mother used to say, Batista would only kill you, right? He was bad. He would only kill you. Castro would kill you, and then he'd make sure that your children could never work, and he'd make sure that your parents didn't have housing, right? Like there was a certain viciousness that they would describe and how Castro would have neighbors report on neighbors. I remember talking to my cousin on voting day, and he said, this is how it works. So starting in the afternoon, people will come over and say, did you, comrade, did you vote? And he'll say, no, I didn't vote. He was virulently anti-Castro. And then they'd say, I'm sure you want to vote. And the whole neighborhood would keep tabs. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, his wife and his mother would be begging, go vote. It'll be so bad for us if you don't vote. This is how you get very high election numbers and participation numbers, right, in Cuba, where everyone seems to be voting for El Presidente. because the whole thing is having neighbors spy on neighbors and turn people in. I mean, it's vicious. So sure, you can describe a list of things that were done, I think, in improvements in society, and then you have to also say this person was a vicious dictator. And I think the American hypocrisy at this moment. We're talking about, who was Fidel Castro and what did he do to Cubans? And I think the way to explain how the complicated feelings that Cubans have about Fidel Castro, Afro-Cubans or African Americans have about Fidel Castro, is to really examine the man himself and what he did. But you cannot dismiss or play down really how vicious he was in ways that some people really consider to be I think, I'm not sure how to explain this, like almost more psychologically vicious than Batista. Again, Batista would only kill you. He was
But it sounds like a voter black voter in Mississippi or in Iowa. I remember when I was running, two farmers came to me and with their grandchildren and said, I like what you said very much. I have to go to a caucus and vote. So I'm with you, but I'm not with you. They have to face their neighbors. My grandson's going to change. So the way that the fear of voting for their choice was in Cuba, and that's wrong. It was as true in Mississippi
I have to.
and Alabama.
We just had a Castro conversation. And so they was talking about voting.
Yep.
I'm listening to Reverend Barber talk about North Carolina, and I'm going, wow, sounds kind of familiar.
Well, it certainly does. The fight and the struggle goes on, Roland. I tell you one thing that's interesting about Fidel Castro. He can be all of those things, can he? I mean, aren't our most complex leaders, aren't us, we as individuals, we're not monolithic, or you can't put us all in one bucket. We're perfectly imperfect, and he's a revolutionary. He and Che Guevara were heroes to African Americans and people around the world because they fought around the world for those who were oppressed. Now, war and revolution is serious business, and I can't endorse how you maintain power or control over any country, if you will, but I will tell you this. History will define Fidel Castro based on who he was to each of us. He was, for African Americans, a revolutionary at a time when we were most oppressed and supported us in all the ways that you described. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, and see, what's interesting to me about this, Lauren and Eugene, is that, again, you talk about dictator killing people.
Absolutely.
Got it. And then you talk about, okay, well, so when you hear members of Congress talk about Fidel Castro, when you read Donald Trump's statement about Fidel Castro, well, who was on the right side of history when it came to apartheid in South Africa?
Yeah, well, the thing
See, and that's the thing. Americans don't. So Castro actually was on the right side of history. The United States was on the wrong side of history.
the thing about Donald Trump and members of Congress is they don't care about the things that were good about Castro. So they don't care about the racism piece, the apartheid piece, any of the things that he did that was good. They really don't care about those issues, as is evidence in North Carolina, where we don't even discuss these things. I mean, we don't even have the DOJ commenting, and they're Democrats, on what's going on in North Carolina, and frankly, what happened with the election. I mean, there are people who are trying to make the argument to some extent that the election was stolen. They don't even want to talk about that. So I'm not a big fan of talking about other countries and the things that they do, because we have issues here that we need to settle. It's certainly not as bad as death squads or stuff like that, but still, we have some issues that we need to take care of, and I don't know that we should get in the business of lecturing other countries.
You know, Castro was on the right side of apartheid. Castro was on the right side of a lot of the issues that affected African Americans around the world. But him being right on those issues do not in no way, discount firing squads. Does no way discount persecution for religious beliefs in Cuba. Does not discount, him hurting his people from just earning a buck. I mean, there was a report.
See, now that's where he's wrong, because one thing about Cuba, if you want a job, you get a job. Okay? Cuba has one of the highest employment rates, or lowest unemployment rates in the world. Anybody who wants to work in Cuba can work.
The problem that I have. This is the problem that I have. So I'm gonna use a sheet of paper. I got this, I got this, and I got this. This is my problem. When this is all Castro, But the discussion that we want to have, we want to say, okay, I'm going to take this one off. I'm going to take this one off, and we only going to talk about that one. That, to me, is the problem when you want to examine who someone was.
We do that in American history all the time.
Right, and
we don't
right.
talk about our atrocities, our things. We don't talk about lynchings. Right? We don't talk about those things. We avoid those topics. So it stands to reason we'd avoid those topics when it comes to somebody. I mean, we don't
Eugene,
want...
I'm going
When
to
you
do
use
this.
firing squads, when you use massive murder as a means to control power, I mean that goes against the entire core of of human rights. I mean, forget American rights, human rights.
But why don't
You know,
we hear about Batista then when you talk about those firing squads? Remember, Batista came to power in a part of a coup d'etat. He has a violent history as lesbian
And
as well.
Batista came to power, and who was he in bed with?
The United States of America.
Bill.
There were no massive killings. I mean, you know, people are using this term as if it's without question.
you don't
There
have
were-
1.5 million people flee the country just for XYZ reasons.
See, and that's okay. And what he just said is a common statement made by people that were anti-Castro about 1.5 million people that fled Cuba. There were 2 massive exoduses from Cuba, which Bill is going to go into in better detail than I.
Well, let's ask the people of El Salvador. Let's ask the people of Honduras. Let's ask the people of Mexico, who are fleeing their countries for economic reasons, right? People have been fleeing Cuba in 2 different waves. There was a first wave, which was mainly white Cubans that left after '59. Let's be clear. Then you have, by the 1980s, a different wave of Cubans that are primarily leaving for economic reasons, fundamentally no different than Mexico. So let's just be clear about what's going on.
Now, the only difference was we didn't embargo Mexico and cut off a bunch of their interactions, okay? But Cuba, we did. And thank goodness that Venezuela stepped in after the Soviet Union fell to support Cuba so that Castro didn't have to come hat in hand begging for relief. And that's just my personal opinion.
In terms of these firing squads, let's talk about who was being killed. Torturers, mafiosi, the corrupt elements of the Batista regime, a regime that was hated in the hemisphere. One of the reasons African Americans really appreciated the Cuban Revolution was precisely because of the steps that were being taken against a racist dictatorial regime. So this is why I disagree, Roland, with Soledad. I don't think that the discussions of hypocrisy are irrelevant. I think it's really important when we're talking with the people of the United States to give context. What was actually happening? How did it actually develop? As opposed to these idiotic tweets from our president-elect.
Even last week, you can speak out against the Castro regime and be arrested for it. All right, I mean, it's not like, you know, freedom of speech or freedom of association or freedom of assembly were protected rights in Cuba, and that's the real issue here. Castro.
Okay, my friend, and right now, if you speak out against Donald Trump in the wrong spot, you're going to have a whole bunch of white supremacists up your ass attempting to do bodily harm to you, if not out and out kill you. So now you tell me, what's the difference?
Violated his people's rights time and time and time again.
And black people have had their rights violated time and time and time again, up to and including today, i.e. North Carolina. Okay? So, you know, this Republican bullshit about Castro was this bad guy and the United States is holier than thou. That's exactly what it is. Bullshit.
And he should not be celebrated for it.
Well, but again, see, this is where.
Celebrate people all the time. Some of them are statues in Statuary Hall right now. We in the United States celebrate people all the time who've done things that are immoral and incorrect. So, I mean, I'm having a hard time getting outraged about what other people are doing.
Well, again, as I keep saying, the senior senator from the state of Mississippi continues to use the desk of Jefferson Davis, who was the greatest traitor in American history and who also put folks to death as the leader of the Confederacy during the Civil War.
We had to argue our
Scott-
Frenchmen about statues of Confederate
I was about to
soldiers.
say that.
Everybody wants to not take the
Scott, go
statue
ahead.
down. That's
Lots of
like-
statutes of racial segregation. Let me just say this: the reason America feeds this narrative even further is because of the white migration of Cubans here for whatever reason, oppressive reasons, who were supporters of Batista. But let's be honest: what's our comparative foreign policy in regard to how we treat Asians versus Cubans, who in many respects are fleeing for similar reasons, if you will? We turn them back. And yet our policy for several years has been to embrace all Cubans who are migrating for whatever reason and to bring them into the U.S. American fold. That's a part of our responsibility in the American narrative on how we treat our brothers and sisters in the Western Hemisphere.
And speaking of how we treat our brothers and sisters, coming up next, we're talking.
All right, so basically that covers the gambit, and you've heard both sides. Now, I will say this. I was following the coverage over the weekend, and MSNBC lived in Little Havana, okay? They lived there, and the majority, all but two people that they interviewed were basically white Cubans. And pretty much they all said the same thing. They were celebrating this man's death, okay, but they were looking at it from a point of view of them losing property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wish I could have seen them interview people that came over in that second wave that were looking for a chance at to better themselves economically. I wish they had interviewed one of those people or a few of those people to see how they felt, because Cuba is, and its economic conditions are a direct result of the United States being pissed off about a guy who basically told them that they could kiss his ass, and because he wasn't going to kiss theirs, he got rid of one of their bed buddies, and he didn't come kowtowing to them. So as far as I'm concerned, yeah, Castro did do a bunch of bad stuff, but overall, as far as I believe his ideology was concerned, I'm 100% on board with it.